David, it's wonderful to have you here with us today because you have been handed responsibility for leading this independent review on sentencing for the government and produced the interim findings this week. In a nutshell, what have you found so far?
So our interim report is about how we got here. It's not about the recommendations as to how we get out of this mess. They'll come in the spring. But what we have essentially set out is an explanation of how in the last 30 years our prison population has essentially doubled. And although there are some complexities about the case mix and more serious cases brought to the courts and obtaining convictions, fundamentally what has driven the increase in the prison population has been longer sentences. Longer sentences that politicians of all parties have provided in response to public opinion. It's a popular move always to say, and we're going to increase the sentence here, but it's been done not in a particularly coherent way. And we haven't built the prison places that are necessary to cope with that. But also we have diverted a lot of resources into building more prison places, even if it's not enough, and to maintaining those prisons and what have you, again, even if it's not enough, away from other parts of the criminal justice system. And it's part of it's an example of how we have a culture which is very focused on punishment, very focused in the belief that the only form of punishment is putting people inside, when our criminal justice system should be broader than that. And fundamentally, we argue, this should be about reducing crime. And you can increase sentences as we have done. It won't have a deterrent effect. Very often it won't have any benefit in terms of rehabilitation, particularly if the prisons are full. And that has come at the expense of the probation system. And there are things that we can do. There's encouraging evidence that quite a lot of the mental health treatment, the drink and alcohol addiction treatment can be effective. There's emerging evidence that problem-solving courts are with much more intensive supervision of, for example, prolific offenders can play a really important role. But we don't have the resources for that because we're throwing everything we've got in the justice space at a growing and growing prison population. And that, I think, is an expensive mistake. It's not good news for the taxpayer. It's not good news for the general public because we're doing less on reoffending than we should do. Therefore, you have more reoffending, more crime, more victims. And I think we can do a lot better than that.
You summed up this collective attitude that we've had over the last 30 years or so as penal populism. And while you mentioned addiction, certain charities that work in this space have really welcomed your analysis, saying Forward Trust, one of them says, we've waited a long time for such a clear and brave analysis of the factors that have led to overcrowding and financial crisis. But there has been some pushback as well. So, I mean, some of it perhaps expected. Patrick O'Flynn, right-wing commentator, called it boilerplate BS progressivism. But I was interested that Danny Shaw, a former colleague of mine at the BBC, obviously you'll know him as well, Home Affairs correspondent, ex-advisor to the current Home Secretary, he said that the report was, and this is a quote, he said, rather sneering and dismissive of public opinion. People called for tougher jail terms, he said, because they didn't have confidence in the system. The sentences for horrendous crimes were too lax and some offenders were let out too early. I mean, this is what people wanted. So the politicians reacted that way.
It is true. And as I fully accept that the offering longer sentences is always going to be popular in that moment. But if you look at where public opinion is today, is there a response of, oh, thank you, politicians, you've given us what we wanted? In fact, the House of Commons Justice Committee undertook some polling a year or so ago. And what they found was that most people think that over the last 25 years, sentences have got softer, they've got lighter, and they think that crime has gone up. And in fact, the opposite is the case. So it's one of those ones in terms of courting short-term popularity. And look, there are, of course, always questions of judgment, and people can completely legitimately say that 20, 25 years ago, some of the sentences that we had were too light. And look, even I am not going to advocate a complete reversal so that we have a sort of sentencing regime that existed. I think there are cases that were too light. But there comes a point where you have to draw a line, and you can't keep going down that route and endlessly saying, oh, there's a problem, the public are upset about a particular crime, let's have another announcement of a sentence going up. It just ultimately doesn't work in terms of a policy, because all the reasons I've set up, you're consuming all your resources and the things that don't really help reduce crime. It certainly doesn't act any more as a deterrent. If someone's going inside for 36 months rather than 30 months, is that going to stop anybody? Of course it doesn't. But ultimately, in terms of the politics, you're still left with a public who think things are a bit soft. So I think there is a need for a change of culture. I'm
going to bring Rachel in a second, but I just want to touch on that because it's really interesting because you write that announcements of longer sentences have been made often in response to high-profile cases. I wonder, we hear about this not just in justice but in health, this idea that it's very difficult as a politician when someone is crying in front of you, very emotional, telling you about a member of their family, not to feel compelled to act. Do you think the balance has been lost there, that politicians as a whole are kind of over-swayed by emotion, anecdote in these awful cases and less by the evidence? Has something gone wrong?
I think it is really difficult for politicians in those circumstances. And I speak with experience. I was Justice Secretary and I did meet families of murdered people. And of course, there is a political consideration. I don't want this person to criticize me and so on. That's not a great look. But there's a human side to it as well. You just as a human being, you want this person to leave thinking that they've been listened to and understood and what have you. But I worry that is not a good way of coming up with a coherent system. And what you end up is a sort of ratcheting effect as someone comes along and sort of says that, here's a specific case. Actually, I want the sentence to be higher. And you think, well, we could do that. It's not going to affect that many people. But then immediately you create an anomaly, a disparity, and someone else a few years down the line, there'll be another tragic occasion and say, well, it's not quite the same set of circumstances, but the defendant is only going to get 15 years, not 25 years. So the pressure then is to increase that in that next category, and you broaden it and broaden it and broaden it. And certainly the changes that were done to sentences of murder in the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, don't think it was the intention of the government at the time, but it has a ratcheting effect. So if you change sentences for murder, then, well, what about attempted murder? What about manslaughter? What about grievous bodily harm? And if you've done grievous bodily harm, what about actual bodily harm? And then, well, what about assault? And the whole way through the system, sentences are dragged up. And, again, I want to stress, I can completely understand the position of victims' families, and I can understand the position of successive ministers who do not want to offend or upset or let down those families. But I think given the crisis that we had in the autumn, and we ran out of space, and we're going to run out of space again unless something is done, we actually have to step back. Spring next year, right? Yeah, spring next year is on the last MOJ forecast. These things can move around, but there or thereabouts. Unless we take some kind of action, we've got a real problem. And if we're going to do this, we should do it properly and have an honest reflection on how we've got here, and then be prepared to accept some radical proposals.
Rachel, the M word, money, comes into it yet again, though, doesn't it? I mean, we either have to make more prison places, well, we're going to have to do that anyway, that costs money. Expanding out rehabilitation and community programs is also expensive. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, it is expensive, but it's not expensive in comparison to prison places. And David's an expert on this, but a prison place, I believe, depends on the prison, costs between 35 and 50,000 pounds a year.
The average is 51,000.
The average is 51,000.
But
okay.
there is a great range within that.
There's a range of that. Okay, but that's more than some of the most exclusive boarding schools. So anything that you can do to keep someone out of prison or in prison for a shorter amount of time will actually save you money. I think there's a misconception among the public, and I certainly had this misconception before I started looking into it for journalism reasons, which is that the sentence doesn't just refer to the jail time. The sentence is the entire length of time that you are under supervision of the court, essentially. So when you see stories about someone getting a 10-year sentence and they only serve 5 years, that's part of the point. That's so for 5 years, you can put other conditions and you can call them back to prison if necessary. And so there are mechanisms where somebody can still be in the process of being punished and perhaps having restrictions on where they can go, what they can do, drugs and alcohol, etc. And there's a very quick mechanism to put them back in prison, but they're not there taking up a space that is needed for somebody who committed a more serious violent crime. So it's also about distinguishing between individuals who are kind of a threat to society and the safety reasons, and individuals where they've served some time and you want to keep an eye on them for the future. So that's kind of one area that's possibly worth looking into. I think the longer sentences thing that David was talking about is really, really interesting, because about a year ago I interviewed Chris Atkins, the journalist who was sentenced to 5 years and spent some of that in Wandsworth, which is one of the worst prisons, and has written 2 books about it. He talked about there being an arms race between Labour and Conservative governments about who could be tougher on crime. And one of the things that I noticed a couple of years ago, when there was sort of mandatory sentences for people who assault retail staff, for shoplifting, every so often there'll be, for cases that involve knives, you'll get these announcements, and I think possibly from a sort of government perspective, making that announcement, it feels like that announcement is free. We're going to have tougher sentences for that. That's not something that costs money immediately, but of course it does cost money because it's more people in prison for longer. So I think a reallocation of the existing funds rather than additional money, but that is difficult to sell to a public who think that we are soft on crime. Worth pointing out, I think, that we have the highest incarceration rate in Europe.
In Western Europe,
in Western Europe,
yes. So if we exclude Poland, that's right. And I think there may be some other Eastern Europeans, but certainly in Western Europe, and by quite a distance. So it's to compare it to, say, Germany and the Netherlands, for example. We have an incarceration rate which was twice as high. And
do we have a twice as criminal population?
No, we don't.
But I'm interested that amongst our European neighbours, we're incarcerating more per 100,000 of the population. But as we'd expect, we're way behind the US. But even New Zealand and Australia as well, we're quite a long way behind them, aren't we?
We are, yes, it's true. And around the way, you can look at other countries, but certainly by European standards, we have got the highest and much higher. But there are countries that have brought it down. So Spain at one point. So we currently have 139 per 100,000. Spain were at one point at 165. They're now on 117. The Netherlands, I think, was sort of 20, 25 years ago, were kind of more or less at the same number that we were, about 100, I think, for every 100,000, which is where we both were at that point. And they've brought it down to 70 or 68. I think it's going up, actually, in the Netherlands, but nonetheless from a pretty low number compared to us. So, yeah, it's gone up a lot. And as I say, it was around about 40,000 until the early 90s. And now, at the top end of the forecasts, I think by the early 2030s, we could be at 112,000, currently at 85 or so. These are big numbers. And Rachel's right. This is expensive. It is really expensive. And look, I'm a very fiscally conservative person here. I think in terms of, from the perspective of the taxpayer, this is not good value for money. Even if if you can control that prison population, I think you have to plough some of those savings into improving other parts of the criminal justice system to make it work. But I do think there is an opportunity here in terms of protecting taxpayers' interests and also bringing crime down. I think there is an opportunity for public services reform.
Can I ask a question on behalf of maybe the sceptics out there, which is, to what extent have these conclusions, and of course I know we haven't got the recommendations yet, but the analysis, how much has that been shaped by the fact that actually we cannot continue as we are, so we're going to have to change?
I think it has meant that there is an opportunity to look at this again, in all honesty. I mean, would the government be doing a sentencing review but for the fact that the prisons are full? I don't know, but I do think one of the strongest arguments in politics is there is no alternative, the Tina argument. And look, there is no alternative here in the sense that however fast we build prisons, and the government is prepared to throw quite a lot of money into building new prisons, something like £10 billion, however fast we build, we will not be able to keep up with capacity as things currently stand. So we have got to do something. And I think it would be much better to do this in a coherent and strategic way rather than the way that the government was forced to do so, and they were forced to do so in the autumn, which is say, right, we're going to move from a release point of 50% to 40% very, very quickly. And in those circumstances, you can't do the preparation, you can't do the sort of build up to release that ideally you would do. And that is very difficult. Much better to kind of work out, face up to the reality. Don't kind of hope for the best, cross your fingers and hope that something will turn up. Face up to it and implement a new regime that ensures that you have always got that capacity. And of course, if you run prisons hot, it's much harder to do the rehabilitation you need. It's also harder on a kind of security basis. How do you control that? How do you stop organised criminal gangs from operating within prisons? If you're really stretched, that becomes much harder. So just in terms of fighting crime, a full prison capacity is very far from ideal.
Rachel, as we move towards the recommendations phase, what do you reckon the chances are of getting cross-party support for this? I mean, it's interesting that the government have appointed David, who obviously was a Conservative MP and former Justice Secretary. Can you see any welcoming of it from the Tory ranks?
Have you seen what the Conservatives are like at the moment? I'm sorry.
That's
I'm
quite
sorry,
right.
But I think it would be great if there could be cross-party consensus on this. And certainly there was cross-party consensus that, what was the acronym you used? Tina?
Tina. Yes. There is no alternative.
There is no alternative. I just cannot see the Conservative Party, the way that they are now, petrified of reform that is, half of their MPs are calling for the death penalty, is where reform are at the moment. I can't necessarily see the goodwill in a cooperation on this issue, not least because both parties are, really anxious about the idea that they're kind of soft on crime. And I think it'd be great if we could reframe it as it's not about being soft on crime. It's about trying to reduce crime, and it's about trying to protect potential future victims who we could help, we could prevent these crimes if we got the criminal justice and the rehabilitation and cut reoffending, if you got all of that stuff right. Some of the suggestions that have been kind of floated in the past of things like looking at the female prison population. I mean, majority are in for non-violent offences. I think around half are themselves victims of sort of domestic abuse. There is interesting stuff coming out of places like Texas, where they've got prisoners on a sort of point system where they can earn time off their sentence by engaging in work programs or rehabilitation programs. There are lots of ideas swirling around. I just don't see the current iteration of the Conservative Party missing the opportunity to attack a Labour government for being soft on crime.
Can I make one point that, because there's a lot of speculation that the answer, or there's an argument that you hear, the answer is about addressing short sentences. Because I was very interested in short sentences when I was Justice Secretary, and I'm sure we will come forward with something on short sentences, but we should not kid ourselves that in itself will provide an answer. That even if you take a very radical approach to short sentences, although there are a lot of people go in and out with short sentences, at any one time, it's a relatively small part of the prison population. I think it's important to acknowledge at this point that the idea that there is a solution which is all about short sentences, I'm afraid, doesn't work. The numbers don't add up. We are going to have to do something that is more radical than that.